A few words today, few thoughts around the sermon title, Weeding an Onion Bed. Now, this title was born during the week based on events that occurred around this time last week when I was on leave. And I didn't attend the service, the Zoom service, because that's part of work for me to go to church. So I avoid my workplace during my leave, which I hope you will forgive me for. And I was on that Sunday morning, which was very similar in weather to today, except I think it was a bit hotter, it had a higher temperature. I set out around 7 o'clock or so, 7:30, to quickly weed an onion bed, a good size onion bed filled with one of my favorite varieties of onions, copra onions. Some of you, I know Charlie Wilkinson also plants copras, a wonderful onion, a globe onion. And the problem was that the weeding was about 2 weeks overdue. Now, any of you that knows anything about crabgrass and rain, copious rain like we had, know what the effect is on crabgrass, and crabgrass in that onion bed did what it was not supposed to do, what crabgrass does. It grows prolifically. And my nature is such that I like to get things done quickly. You know, move in high energy, get the job done, move on to the next task or project. And I attempted to do the same, but I had the extra initiative or the incentive because of the temperature and the humidity. After about 5 minutes, I was sweating and it was really hot, even early in the morning. So I was moving fast into that onion bed, trying to get rid of the crabgrass. And after my efforts, I looked back and it looked like a small tornado went through the onions. I never realized how finicky and tender onion plants are. And it was a good stand of onions, about, I would say, 30 feet tall leaves on them, and the globes were just beginning to form beautifully. But it looked terrible where I've moved in to clear out the crabgrass. And those of you who are familiar with onions know once you knock them over, and that happens so easily, growth for the biggest part stopped. So I had to reassess and make the decision in the interest of a proper onion harvest to change my methodology. I realized I had to work much more deliberately, slowly and carefully pick my target, select it, get a firm grip on it, and then pull with the necessary sensitivity in the right direction so that I don't break the necks of more onions. So what I anticipated about 45 minutes to an hour task developed into a 4-hour project. And it wasn't cooling down. But it gave me a lot of time for thinking that I didn't plan on for that Sunday morning. I thought in the first place, as I was weeding the onion bed, about my grandfather, who was a teacher, but also a part-time farmer. And I still remember him and his love for shallots, but also for a variety of onion that I asked him once what it was, and he was very proud to say Texas grano. And I ordered my onion plants also from a supplier in Texas. And after seeing and experiencing the results, I changed my mind about Texas and said there are still good things that can come from Texas. But that's a story for another day. So as I was reading, I was also thinking about those that produce our food, especially those that try to do so while not practicing destructive farming methods. Those especially that try to farm organically and take good care of the land at the same time. And I know something, and I've experienced it with Krista as we farm our few beds, what it takes to produce something on a sustainable basis. I also thought about those that pick our fruit. I was suffering for a few hours in high humidity and high temperature. But some people do what I did for a few hours on a daily basis in more difficult temperatures so that we can have food in our stores and food on our plates. I have a lot more empathy with their situation and the conditions that they have to endure so that they can make most often a meager living under very difficult conditions. I also thought in the process, as I was weeding, doing my deliberate, precise picking of the crabgrass and other beautiful weeds, about our philosophy towards the economy, our focus on production. And my mind dwelled on my experience in, for instance, the financial accounting classes for one master's program I did in South Africa, where in one particular instance we were working on the formula for ideal growth of a company and or an economy. And it was a very long equation. And I remember asking the professor, who had a distinguished career in the private sector as a CEO of several companies, and then became a very good teacher of financial accounting. And I asked him, what is the ideal growth rate? They said, if you know that, you would be a Nobel Prize winner. And it was a shock to me that with all our economic theory and all our experience and the knowledge that we have, that we still don't know, at least then didn't know, what the ideal growth rate would be. I also remember from those days working with a professor who's now teaching in New Zealand. He was professor of organizational theory, trying to integrate the concept of Ubuntu with a market economy. And I remember how we theorized and how we thought about it and wondered how would it be possible to integrate a philosophy that is in essence focused on existing through and for the common good of a specific group, however narrowly or broadly you define the boundaries of that group, with the profit motive. And especially as it has become a way of thinking that the market economy and all economic activity, and specifically what is done for companies in the corporate sector is done for the benefit of the shareholders. That's the people that are the ones that should be kept happy and for whom the economy and that company's activities and profits exist. I also thought about what's happening with us in this pandemic. As a nation, as a world society, and specifically the economic consequences of what we are experiencing. And more so what Washington's response was to what regular folk experience, with unemployment rampant and with the worrisome reality that by the end of this week, that $600 unemployment benefit will run out. And the mortgage and rental and lease holidays will also be suspended. I'm concerned because I don't think there's a plan in place yet, and I don't foresee that it will be. So those things concerned me, and later on I started thinking about our role as Christians and as churches in all of this. And specifically, I asked myself the question, our hesitancy to talk about money, and specifically money in the economic sense in broader society as far as economic justice is concerned. And I wandered into our sacred text, trying to find something there that could perhaps guide us in our thinking. And I happened on these two very interesting stories. The first from the book of Genesis, with the narrative of part of the narrative, that wonderful narrative of Joseph. Joseph the dreamer with his beautiful Technicolor coat. I assume it was Technicolor or something similar that we would call Technicolor. And his wanderings where he wasn't the most popular guy with his brothers, and how they eventually sold him off to a merchant. And he ended up in Egypt. And to make a long story short, he ended up as the second most powerful guy in Egypt, doing the bidding of the Pharaoh, but making this wonderful plan in the days of plenty, providing enough in the storage so that when the famine, the 7 years of difficulty, of drought and so forth arrived, that Egypt still had food, and food not only for itself, but for the rest of the world. I find it peculiar that Joseph would still sell to the Egyptians when they were famished. One would think that the Pharaoh would, out of compassion for his own people, provide it for them, like food assistance. But that's probably not the way of empire. And that's probably also one of the reasons why the Egyptian empire did not manage to be sustainable, because of the high degree of reliance on slave labor, and of probably also not very sound economic practices from a sustainability perspective. Joseph the dreamer, through proper planning, was able to provide for the Egyptians and for the world, and also to save his family in the process. Whether it's historically true, we really don't know, but it doesn't matter. The story is a wonderful story, and the focus of this narrative is not on, I think the economic policies of Egypt when Joseph was there. It is to create the narrative of God's providence in providing for the Israelites through Joseph and his wanderings around the Middle East. Then we find the narrative about the early Christian church. We find the Apostle Paul urging all the churches that he started and founded and that he was ministering to throughout a large region of the ancient world to take up the offerings, not only for themselves, but to maintain the bond with the mother church, with the church in Jerusalem, and to continue to raise funds and to gather contributions for the poor church in Jerusalem. Now it's strange that the mother church, the church in Jerusalem, which was the first Christian church, that it was so poor. One would associate the capital and the mother church with a flourishing enterprise with some status. And it always puzzled me, and I tried to figure out why was the Jerusalem church so poor compared to other churches. And sociologists and anthropologists, historical sociology, seems to indicate that there was a lot of widows, a very high percentage of widows in the Jerusalem church at that time. And these widows were very reliant on the church for their sustenance and to be able to make it, to make a living. It was also not easy to provide for the people living in the city, the regular peasants, the people of the inner city, if you want to call it that, because there was no agricultural land close by, and also because of all the taxes levied by the empire on people traveling into Jerusalem, and also on produce or any foodstuffs entering Jerusalem. So there were a lot of taxes which made it very expensive for people to live in the city. So this call from Paul, out of compassion and because the love of God unites us and we have this bond in God's Spirit that keep us together, that establishes this strong and unique relationship. Because of that, this project, ongoing project by Paul, take care of the church in Jerusalem. As we consider these two stories, as we consider where we find ourselves in the pandemic, but also considering where we find ourselves globally and as world society, I think the pandemic provides for us a unique opportunity to reassess, to reconsider. And as Joseph the dreamer, with his thinking and long-term vision, his wisdom, and the technological abilities centered in the empire of the time, the Egyptian empire. Perhaps that element combined with the compassion and the acknowledgement that we are all one, that we are all in this together, may create the opportunity, the window for us to look at things in a new way. I think we need thinking and we need conversation that is not intimidated by vested political interests, especially of our time. I think we need thinking and conversation that is not censored by the climate of intolerance and division. And I think we need thinking and conversation that is not impaired by the short-term and self-centered paradigms that has become acceptable and fashionable. Our addiction to consumerism has not served us well. There are surveys in Britain and in the US done in the time of the pandemic that indicates that only 6% to 12% of people want to go back to work in the same way as they did before the pandemic. There are only around 13% of numerous surveys, the average, that wants to return to the normal that some people describe as bizarre and not conducive to life. I think we need to find a new normal, and I think the church needs to play a role in that. I think there is a huge responsibility for the church in all of this, and I think we can respond to our calling to be a healing and a life-giving influence in the world. Perhaps we can fire up our prophetic imagination by listening to what one author calls poetry as a lovely backdoor to our consciousness. Poetry that enables us to bypass our habitual barricades of thoughts and feelings and perhaps use that backdoor to our consciousness to look at reality afresh, to evaluate and assess for new possibilities. Rebecca Elson, who is an astronomer, or let me rather say who was an astronomer by profession, she passed away in the last part of the previous century, I think the last year actually. A Canadian-American astronomer, but also a poet. In one of her other works, she refers to us, looking at it from us, meaning the human species, humanity as survivors of immeasurable events, working with geological time, and how life managed to survive and most often flourish as well over all those massive timescales. She refers to us, to humans, as small, wet miracles. Small, wet miracles, probably from the perspective of astronomy, where the Earth is the third rock from the sun. Human life and a human becomes a small, wet miracle. Without instructions, he says, only with the imperative of change. Taking that in and trying to work with that, looking at the pandemic, where we find ourselves all of a sudden, without proper preparation in any way, in a world that has changed, to use Elson's words, immeasurably, finding ourselves scattered across a changed world 6 feet apart, disoriented probably to an extent at least, and as one author said, blinking in disbelief with at least some or a good measure of heartache. The imperative of change, of us, the small, wet miracles. I think there is an imperative from an evolutionary perspective, but there is also a moral obligation on us as Christians, as followers of Jesus, as people who assign value to the sacred text that we listen to today. There is a moral obligation on us to revitalize our imagination, to try and move from the current to the desired future. And it is time, I think, for us to stop listening to those that tell us we cannot do it, that want to deny our ability to find the common good, and that want to divide us and instill fear in us so that we continue to live in animosity, and that the only way of existing is partisanship and anger at one another and at the world in general. Let us respond from an ethos of compassion. And as I've been taught the hard way in the hot sun in an onion bed last Sunday, let us learn that perhaps our approach that has brought us this far have exceeded the limits of our only home in the universe at this stage of planet Earth. That we need, for our sake, but even more so for the sake of our children, of our grandchildren, and those that will follow them. For all those wet miracles that are to come, for their sake and the sake of all life, to find a new way of being in the world, deliberately not making production our taskmaster, and as Christians being willing to walk the road required, to do the hard yards of giving up our addiction to consumerism and giving up our addiction to materialism, and to lead the way to a better place. It is not in the realm of miracles. It is possible. And unless we declare ourselves unwilling to return to what we have been conditioned to accept as normal, unless we can define a new normal that is more friendly towards life, that is more ethical, and that is morally defensible, what we experience now, living under such constraints, will become the normal that we long for and that we want to return to in a future that could probably and will probably be much less pleasant than this pandemic. Let us embrace one another and open ourselves to the wisdom of Paul, acknowledging the bond that exists by being part of the process that birthed, as Elson said, these wet miracles, so that we may walk into a future filled with flourishing life on this beautiful planet of ours, where there is enough for everyone and where scarcity does not need to be the driving force. May God's Spirit lead us in that way.